My name's Doug Hilton. I'm the director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here for a very special 50th anniversary celebration of Professor Jacques Miller's association with the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. I was very pleased that Graham sat down there because I think when I added up the years of experience before Graham sat down, it was something just under 1,000. And then when Graham sat down, we got over that landmark. I think in the first couple of rows, there's somewhere near 1,000 years of immunology and cancer research experience sitting in front of me. So that's very nice. And it is a day where we're celebrating the contribution of our elders. And with that, I'd also like to begin today's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're celebrating this afternoon, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders of any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups that are here with us today. Gus is going to introduce Jacques more formally, but what I'd like to do is just say a very few words about my perception of Jacques. And this comes from somebody who grew up in a division, the Division of Cancer and Haematology, the old Cancer Research Unit, where immunologists were not perhaps as highly regarded as they were in the rest of the Institute. But I have to say, despite that upbringing, I've been touched by a number of Jacques' qualities. The first is his ability to give perhaps one of the loveliest teaching seminars of anybody I've ever heard, somebody who is fulsome in their acknowledgement of the contributions of others and can put a sweep of immunology history together in a most beautiful way. And I think that generosity of spirit is something that goes through Jacques' whole life. So he's somebody I've always thought of as not having a work-life balance, but having a wonderful life balance. His work, his art, his generosity, his mentorship are things that I think have touched every student, staff member and laboratory head in the Institute. He's a generous man that I think behaves with a grace that we would all do very well to imitate. And with that, I'd like to introduce another of our elder statesmen, Professor Sir Gustav Nossal, who is going to more formally introduce Jacques. Gus.
So much, Doug, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How wonderful it is to see this chock-a-block full room, everyone wishing to pay tribute to an extraordinary scientist who's celebrating 50 years at this iconic institution. But the drama actually precedes those 50 years by a little bit. It goes back to September 1965. A certain rather brash 34-year-old individual had just been appointed the director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. And what was his very first action? His very first action was to pick up the telephone at his own expense from his own home, call London, and invite Jacques Miller to come as a professor to the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. Why was this my first action? Well, I tell you, it is not due to the fact that I have valued Jacques as a friend for 74 years. Yes, Jacques and I were at school together. He was 1 year behind me at St Aloysius College. We made good friends, at least in part because the Refo kids tended to stick together. And Jacques, even then, displayed the generosity of which Doug has made mention. Because remember, it was war, and lots of things were rationed. Jacques' dad was a wonderful chef. And having been a prominent banker before the war, he emigrated to Australia, and guess what he became? He became a poultry farmer. So one of his famous sand cakes could contain 24 eggs, which, of course, during the war was absolutely impossible for anyone else. And Jacques, I've never quite found out how he got that amount of butter, because butter, of course, was also rationed. Well, Jacques generously brought these cakes to school, and it was magic, and we enjoyed them enormously. But Jacques and I are both a little bit obsessive-compulsive. And so, it was wartime, it was difficult to get the kind of fountain pen that we thought befitted our status. So Jacques somehow purloined these two beautiful Parker pens, and we had one each. But the question then was what to do about ink, because Parker pens needed a special ink called Quink, and that really was impossible to get. Jacques somehow managed. We shared. I wish our handwriting did the pens more justice. Well, Jacques and I both ended up as ducks of St. Aloysius College. I mentioned that for a particular reason you'll see in a moment. I in 1947, Jacques in 1948. And the next year, would you believe, another Aloysian, Mark Playest, was ducks of Aloysius. And these three people, in due course, all went to medicine at Melbourne University, all went to Prince Alfred Hospital, and all ended up at or very near the top of their final year. So that was a bit of a joke, wasn't it? Mark's was a very sad story. Mark rang me up one day. I was 2 years ahead of him, and working away at hospital, and Mark rang me up, and he had gone into clinical research under the late fabled Riven Blackburn, whom many of you will know. And he said, Gus, I'm facing a big decision. I think I've got a vocation to the priesthood. And what do you think? I said, Jacques, well, you and I had exactly this, Mark, you and I had exactly the same upbringing. We were all brought up by the Jesuits. You're pretty sure it isn't just due to brainwashing from the Jesos that you want to do this? He said, no, look, I really feel I must do this. And I said, gosh, go ahead. You'll have a wonderful life. There'll be lots of wonderful things to do as a Jesuit academic. And Mark then did the very arduous job of studying for the priesthood as a Jesuit, which takes many more years than just being a regular parish priest. And would you believe, on the day some years later, that he was to be ordained, and for some odd reason the ordination was going to be in Adelaide, because we were all Sydney boys, of course, he was killed on the car crash going over. So he never did get to be a Catholic priest. Well, it transpired that when Jacques was a junior resident, I not infrequently had a rotation as his senior RMO at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. And you will not be surprised to hear that Jacques was the very model of conscientiousness. No one could have had a better junior resident. Until the spring of 1956, when there was a marked change. And all of a sudden, particularly on a Friday afternoon, Jacques would ring at about 5:20 p.m, and still with that delightful Gallic accent, say, Gus, can you cover for me? I have to get away. Gus, I've got to skip out. Gus, please, just till 6 o'clock, can you cover for me? Well, love had struck. And Jacques had met the marvellous Margaret Howan, of beloved memory, who was a lovely nurse at Prince Alfred. And she required Jacques' presence more urgently than did Prince Alfred Hospital. It was a wonderful marriage, a long marriage, and we can all understand how devastated Jacques was at Margaret's death after such a long and loving marriage. And Jacques, we also still miss her very much indeed. Well, backtracking a bit, Jacques and I both decided separately to head for medical research. Jacques shot off to the United Kingdom for his postdoc. I shot off to Stanford in California, USA, for the early stages of our medical research careers. And I was busily working away there at Stanford in the genetics department. And one day, there's a very excited knock on my door. It was one of the most prestigious people of the whole university, Dr. Henry Kaplan, who was the head of radiology, and himself quite an expert on the thymus gland. It was June of 1961. And he said, "Gus, I have to tell you what your countryman has just done." He didn't even knew Jacques. This man has discovered the function of the thymus. And Henry had just come back from a conference in Perugia, Italy, where Jacques made the first public presentation of his wonderful work on the thymus gland, which I hope he may have a chance to describe to us in a little more detail in a few minutes. So wasn't that exciting? Guess what your countryman has done? Well, soon after that, Jacques returned to Australia in 1966, as you've heard. And the first thing he did was he teamed up with Graham Mitchell, who was his first PhD student. And together they did seminal work on what we then called antigen-reactive cells, which were responsible for delayed type hypersensitivity, graft rejection, and antibody-forming cell precursors, the AFCPs, which, as the name implies, were the cells which on stimulation made antibody. But the most amazing thing that Graham and Jacques discovered wasn't just these two classes of cells, but the fact that they actually had to collaborate for antibody formation to proceed properly. This did not go down very well with everybody. Mac Burnett said, "Anyone who has to use adult thymectomized, lethally irradiated, bone marrow reconstituted mice to make a discovery has only discovered an abomination." And the patrician Jim Gowans, who was the doyen of British immunologists and Peter Medawar's greatest student, said, I don't care what Jacques Miller says, lymphocytes, as I have seen them, constitute a homogeneous population. But the best of all was the late Bede Morris. Never at a loss for a good quip, Bede Morris said, by this time the lovely acronym B cells and T cells, B and T, had been coined. B for antibody-forming cell precursor, T for antigen-reactive cells. Bede Morris said, well, B and T has only one significance for me. It's the first and last letters of the word bullshit. Lest you think that Jacques is only a swotty scientist, let me remind you that he is a wonderful artist, and let me give you an invitation to his next one-man show at the Skepsy Gallery in Malvern, where it will feature mainly his well-known work with brush and ink, and most of you will know what wonderful work this represents. What you will not know as well is that Jacques is a brilliant pianist, that Jacques has inherited the family tradition and is a talented chef. And what you almost certainly won't know is that while beavering away at the Hall Institute, making discovery after discovery to do with T cells and B cells, Jacques actually found time to do an arts degree and majoring in Italian. But you will have guessed the last bit. Of course he came first in the year. Jacques, I could go on for a long time. I simply want to say you have been a wonderful colleague and friend. You have been an honoured pioneer of our great discipline of immunology. You have been an adornment to the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. We congratulate you and wish you well.
Well, thank you very much, Doug, and thank you very much, Gus, for a glowing introduction. Gus always gives lovely introductions. Well, what I plan to do, if I can find the next slide, is to summarize the knowledge that we had in cellular immunology before the mid-1960s, so you know where we stood. And then to go on to give a little bit of details about my work on leukemia, which led to my work on Alzheimer's. And finally, if there is time, I'd like to give at least one example of how T-cell work has been translated into the clinics with fantastic results, especially in cancer. Now, before 1961, Alzheimer's was thought to have no function. In Greek, a Greek anatomist called Galen thought it was a seat of the soul. I don't know what he meant by soul, but certainly it has remained an organ of mystery for at least 2,000 years. Vesalius was an Italian anatomist, very good one actually, and he thought the thymus would protect the heart from the bony sternum. If you looked up Blackman's dictionary as late as 1970, you'd see that it has evolved sexual maturity. They didn't say how. And immunologists up to the 1970s thought it has something to do with dying lymphocytes, like a graveyard. It's certainly a vestigial organ, a graveyard for lymphocytes that have died. Now, I must emphasize that before 1970, we did not have the markers that we do have now. Cy1 came up in, Cy1 came up in the late 60s or mid 60s, but not used yet until 70. CD markers were not available, and we didn't have a fluorescent activated cell sorter. The only way we could use different markers was to use different strains of mice, which differed at the major histocompatibility complex, which we call H2, or at minor complexes like H1, H3. We could use radioactive precursors of RNA and DNA, and we could use chromosome marker when they were available. Only the T6 strain has a chromosome marker, and you can only see cells in metaphase, of course. Now, even the small lymphocyte which circulates, its function was not known until Jim Gans, a postdoc in Howard Flores' laboratory, worked on it. And the only way to get pure lymphocytes in those days, since we have no fluorescent activated cell sorter, was to cannulate the main duct, with lymph duct, which is called thoracic duct. And there you can see small lymphocytes. So he used those small lymphocytes, and he actually injected them into the bloodstream after labeling them with tritated uridine. There's one here. That's tritated uridine. It came from the thoracic duct. It was labeled and injected into the bloodstream. And he found out what happens to them. They recirculate from blood into lymphoid tissues, into certain areas of lymphoid tissue, back to blood via the thoracic duct. If it did exactly the same with the thymus, take out lymphocytes from the thymus, inject them into the bloodstream, they ended up in the spleen and died. They were not long-lived cells that recirculated, but short-lived cells, and they died in the spleen. If he took thoracic duct lymphocytes and together with antigen, a very powerful antigen, and put them into irradiated mice to find out what they might do, they transformed into these cells, which are quite different from small lymphocytes. They incorporated precursors of DNA, let's treat it as thymidine injection, and they transferred immune responsiveness to a host which was immunoincompetent. So they were competent to transfer immune responsiveness. They could do that by producing antibody or by producing a cellular immune response, like a skin graft or a graft versus host reaction. And he thought that the same lymphocyte could either be an antibody-forming cell or produce a cellular immune response. If he took thymus lymphocytes and did exactly the same experiment, nothing happened. It did not transfer immunity to an immune-deficient mouse. So there was a lot of observations before 1960 to persuade people that the thymus has nothing to do with immunity. As I said, cytological hallmarks of the immune response that occurs in circulating lymphocytes, but not in lymphoid tissues. Sorry, and in lymphoid tissue, but not in normal thymus. Thymus lymphocytes, unlike blood lymphocytes, do not recirculate. Adoptive transfer of thymus lymphocyte does not transfer immunity. And most importantly, as the people working on leukemia had found out, adult thymectomy does not have any effect on immune potential. And these are the conclusions which led Sir Peter Medawar to state rather categorically we shall come to regard the presence of lymphocytes in the thymus as an evolutionary accident of no very great significance. Now, a completely different approach was to be used to show that these conclusions, seemingly justifiable, were indeed flawed. So now I'd like to talk about my own work. In 1958, I left Australia, got a fellowship to take me to London to do a PhD at the Cancer Research Institute in London. They didn't have any space for me, so they sent me to the Satellite Institute, which has a glorious name of Parawood Research Station, Nightingale's Lane in Chalfont St. Giles. This was a beautiful place, as you can imagine. There was a converted laboratories in the main Tudor-style house here. There was a new building where radiation work was to be held, and there was, of course, the original stables, horse stables. And the stables had been transformed into mouse holding rooms. And yet they still didn't have any room for me, so they suggested that I start my work in a shed, which is shown here. And so the original work on the thymus was done here, but eventually I got more space and part of the horse stables for housing my mice. Now, for certain reasons which I haven't got time to go into, I decided to work on lymphocytic leukemia in mice. So let me tell you a bit about lymphocytic leukemia, what had been discovered. That strains of mice called Leukemia or C58, which are high leukemic strains, they develop leukemia whatever you do to them. There are strains of mice which are low leukemic strains, they don't develop leukemia. But you can induce leukemia in low leukemic strains by giving certain chemicals or by giving you certain doses of irradiation. And the thymectomy, as I mentioned before, at 1 to 2 months of age, that's in the adult in mice, not in the adult, prevented leukemia, whether spontaneous or induced. Now, at the time I arrived in London, there was a new way of inducing leukemia that had been discovered by Ludwig Ross in the United States. And that's shown on the next slide. He simply took leukemic tissues from high leukemic strain mice when they developed leukemia, made an extract, passed the extract through a filtrate, and called that a virus. And he passed the extracts to several generations of low leukemic strain mice to get a very powerful passage called passage A, which caused leukemia in low leukemic strains in 100% of cases. But there was one thing he had to do. He could not use adult low leukemic strains. He had to use babies, 1 day old, because if he injected the extract later on, they wouldn't get leukemia. And that's why I've got a baby here, C3H, which is the low leukemic strain. So I thought that would be a very nice study for my PhD, and I wrote to him asking him if he could send me his mice, because I didn't have time to make the extract. It would take several years to passage it. So he very nicely did send me the mice, fortunately, and I just, of course, repeated his work, and you can see it's quite true. If you inject 1 day, you get 100% leukemia in low leukemic strain. If you inject at 2 months, you don't. If you inject at 3 months, not shown on the slide, you get nothing. The next thing I did, which was obvious, is do a thymectomy, adult thymectomy, because everybody had done adult thymectomy in other types of leukemia. So I did an adult thymectomy, and actually was back-to-back with Ludwig Gross. He had done it too. So I published that in Nature. Adult thymectomy does prevent leukemiogenesis in this system too, just like it does in the other systems. So that's fine. But then I did something which nobody else did. I thought, why not put the thymus graft, a neonatal thymus graft, in these mice that have been adult thymectomy mice? Would you restore leukemiogenesis? Would you restore the potential for leukemia development? And you do. Well, that's okay, that's fine. You'd say, well, so what? But wait a minute. What about instead of putting it at 1 month immediately after thymectomy, put it on later, at 2 to 3 months? And what if you don't do it at 2 to 3 months, put it on later still, at 4 to 6 months? And what if you do it even later, put it on at 6 months after thymectomy? You still get leukemia. So what's happening? Surely the virus, if it's a virus, and it was proven to be a virus later, the virus must remain latent. And actually, it could be recovered from the non-leukemic tissues of thymectomized mice. As you can expect, that was published in the next Nature paper, and I won't give the results because it's too complicated. So the virus must have remained latent. So what actually is happening here? Well, at this stage, you have to invent certain scenarios. One of them, which I followed, was the following. The virus has to be injected into newborn mice because it can only multiply in certain cell types which are present in the neonatal thymus. That's why. The virus multiplies very rapidly and then spills over into the periphery where it resides, perhaps in macrophages somewhere. But the cells which the virus has transformed in the thymus, they have to undergo several mutations in order to become malignant and to go out. That takes longer than 1 month. So when you come along and do a thymectomy at 1 month, you have not removed the source of the virus, but you have removed the source of the leukemic cell. And that's why when you put the virus back later on, you do get leukemia. So that can be tested very easily. And that's the reason why I did. And these are expected results. If the virus must multiply in 1-day-old thymus, if it must do that, then take out the thymus before you put in the virus, put the virus at 1 day, and then come along later. The virus had no thymus to multiply in, it's been flushed out, and you expect nothing, no leukemia. If, on the other hand, the virus can multiply outside the thymus, like for example, in the bone marrow, then it doesn't matter where you take the thymus, you should get leukemia. So that's the reason why I did neonatal thymectomy, not because I wanted to find the function of the thymus, because of this experiment. So now, here's a neonatal thymectomized mice. The thymus is shown here, and there. And here, note the salivary gland, because I'm going to refer to that later. And they do very well. The sham thymectomy mice have simply their chest open and closed. This is to control for inflammation and wound healing and so on. And you can see, apart from 1 or 2 mice here, the sham thymectomy mice and the neonatal thymectomy mice grow up perfectly healthy until sometime later. And this is what happened. That mouse here is sick. It's lost weight. It's certainly different from its sham thymectomy mice litter mate. So that had never been seen after adult thymectomy. Never. So, of course, I decided I must look into it, and that's what you see. Lesions in the liver, like hepatitis virus would do that. Deficiency in lymphocytes in certain areas of the lymphoid system, and also in the circulation. And since Gowns had shown that lymphocytes in the circulation are responsible for cellular immunity, of course I put skin grafts on these neonatally thymectomized mice. And even a rat skin graft was not rejected. So, I mean, no one had seen a rat skin graft grow such luxuriant tufts of hair onto a mouse. So that was pretty obvious that something had gone wrong. The next thing was to put a thymus back, because here you can put not just the same thymus as the host, but you can put a foreign thymus, since foreign tissues are not rejected after neonatal thymectomy. So sham thymectomize, they reject, as you can see here, the neonatally thymectomized that get a thymus graft from the same donor as the host. They do reject, but not as fast as that, but still they reject both skin grafts. But if you now put in a thymus graft which is different from the host, cis-rh and cis-black, you will see that they reject the other graft, but not the graft which is identical to the thymus donor. So clearly they are tolerant of thymus donor type skin. And this prompted me to write in a discussion of that paper, antigenic material might make contact with certain cell types differentiating in the thymus and in some way prevent these cells from maturing to a stage where they would be capable of reacting immunologically, and I even call prevention of maturation as selective or immunological thymectomy. Now that has not been cited in the early parts of the immunology in the early decade. If my name had been Burnett, that would have been cited 10,000 times. And the neonatally thymectomized were, of course, tested for antibody formation, and they could not produce antibody against a variety of protein antigens and against sheep erythrocyte, but they did produce antibody against some other antigens. Now, we had to prove that the thymus does its job by putting cells out into the periphery. Now, how can we do that without markers? So I had to use a T6 marker chromosome, which you can see here is two tiny little chromosomes which are seen only in T6 mice, not in other strains of mice. So the following experiment was done. Take a thymus, doesn't matter which type, but you implant it into a neonatally mouse which has a T6 marker. And when that grows up, you can immunize it and then look into the lymphoid tissues to see if there's any cells which are coming from the thymus graft. And we did, of course, I found them up to 15%, which is quite a good number. So obviously the thymus graft must have put out cells into the periphery, which did the work. Then what about thymus in the adult? I told you that adult thymectomy does nothing, but what happens if the lymphoid system has been damaged or has been by radiation or something like that? Well, in this case, the adult thymus is still required in order to restore the immune function after the lymphoid system has been destroyed. So sham thymectomy, they reject. Adult thymectomy without radiation, they reject, but adult thymectomy with radiation, they don't reject. So even the adult thymus has an immune function. Then, what about tumors? Now, one of the biological raison d'etre of homograft immunity was said to be because we try to reject tumors when we get them. So, of course, I did try it with a very powerful carcinogenic agent. And even though it's very powerful, thymectomized mice were much more prone to develop tumors, as you can see here, and to develop malignancy. And if you just look at the results shown in the Nature paper here, you can see that it's an obvious tendency for the sham thymectomized mice to have less tumors than the neonatally thymectomized mice on the left. And look, this what happened. This happened just spontaneously. Parotid tumors in the neonatally thymectomized mice. Now, the importance of this slide is that cis-brown black mice are highly resistant to polymervirus. You can inject lots of polymervirus in them. They never come down with polymervirus tumor. But this happens spontaneously in neonatally thymectomized C-stem black mice, which was fantastic. So all this is summarized here: marked lymphocytic immune function in all susceptible to infection, susceptible to some tumors, tolerant of thymus donor strain, and no immune defects unless previously irradiated in the adults. And of course, some lymphocytes do emigrate. Now, how did the immunological community react to all this, which is quite novel? The data was not criticized. They can't criticize the data when you have a rat skin on a mouse. But they say mouse strain must be unusual, or if it happens in mice, it doesn't happen in humans. One group could not repeat the observation. Turned out that they were removing the salivary glands. Now that shows that even the anatomy of the thymus was not appreciated. And mice can convert host table must have been exposed to so many infections that the additional trauma of neonatal thymectomy or irradiation precipitated immunodeficiency. Okay, well, I thought this might be worth looking at. So I got a fellowship to take me to America, was the only place in the world they had at that time germ-free facilities. So I did the whole work in the germ-free tank. Here I'm on the left. And then we do the skin grafts. And this is what happens. Beautiful, healthy, fat, C-stem black mice, 6 months old, not rejecting a graft which is different from the host at a major histocompatibility complex. So people started to believe in the immune function of the thymus. The check was written up in a London paper. And this mouse was discovered actually in 1962, but mostly in 1968 did they work on it and showed that it has no thymus, or it has a thymus, but it's deficient, and it will take, as you see, skin grafts. So that's it. And then Gus Nossal, as he mentioned, invited me back to Australia, and Burnett raised the question whether there is an equivalent of the bursa in a mammal, because in chickens, the bursa is responsible for antibody production, the thymus for cellular immunity. So he wanted to know if we don't have a bursa. So he suggested later that in mammals it is highly probable that the thymus also carries out the function of the bursa in a chicken, which is to feed into the body the cells whose descendants produce antibody. And that fitted very well with my finding that neonatal thymectomy not only impairs cellular immunity, but also antibody production. So the first thing I did when I got back here is to work with Graham Mitchell, my first PhD student down here. Been friends ever since. He had hair in those days. And the only way to get purified lymphocytes from mice, from normal mice or neonatal mice, was to do thoracic duct cannulation, like Gowns had done in rats. And that's what we got. So we put the cannula in the thoracic duct here. It's in the abdomen, the little part of the thoracic duct that's in the abdomen. And then we cannulated the mice, and we got this thoracic duct lymphocytes. Right, now, if you drain the thoracic duct for a period of time, this is what you get. In normal mice or in sham thymectomized mice, you see the curve flattens out here, which means that you have drained all the cells that you can drain out of the mouse. If you do the same thing to a neonatally thymectomized mouse, this is what you get. So there's a tremendous deficit. There's a 2-log difference. Let's call the top one 10 to the 8 for argument's sake, and the bottom one 10 to the 6. That's 1 in 100 cells are coming from, not from the thymus, but from some other source. I don't know what it is. But it's not enough to cause a problem in the next experiment that we did. It won't be enough. 1 in 100 contaminants are not going to spoil the results. So the experiment, which is one of the most important experiments done, is this one here, where we have 2 strains of mice which differ at the H2 locus, A and C, just for argument's sake, A and C. And we make a F1 hybrid, take the thoracic duct lymphocytes from it, and inject thoracic duct lymphocytes from this into a identical host which has been adult, thymectomized, irradiated. So now this immuno-incompetent host there cannot make an immune response. But it also will die because it doesn't, thoracic duct lymphocytes don't have hematopoietic stem cells. So we have to protect it. If you want to immunize it, you have to have time, you have to protect it, and we chose to protect it with bone marrow from one of the parental strains, doesn't matter, or from the F1, intravenously, and then now this mouse will survive and will make an antibody response. It's like a normal mouse. It's been restored. So we injected with sheep red cells, and the beauty of this experiment is that we can make antibody in A against C, or we can make antibodies in C against A. So we have a marker for what the cells that come from A or the cells that come from C by this antiserum. If we don't add, if we do a test for antibody formation, we use Petri dishes overlaid with agar, and on top of the agar we put sheet red blood cells, and then we put the spleen cells of these immunized mice. Spleen is the main area where antibody-forming cells are produced, and then we can see antibody-forming cells if they destroy the red cells underneath, you get a plaque. So that's what you get, this, without antiserum. Now we can test, where do the antibody-forming cells come from? Do they come from the T cells, which are the thymus-derived cells, I should say, which are the ACOR-C? If they do, we should be able to kill them with a C anti-A serum. Let's use the anti-C serum first. The AC is present in both, so you expect with the anti-C serum to get complete destruction, and you do. But the important one is the C anti-A serum, which can only kill the cells, the antibody-forming cells, if they come from the thymus. And so you should get exactly the same as that. But what we did get was this, absolutely black and white. It's no, if I ever show you quickly the data which has been published, so the important one is here. It doesn't cause any diminution of plaque-forming cells, none at all, no reduction. So clearly, the antibody-forming cells do not come from thymus-derived cells, not from cells, but come from bone marrow. But why is it then that neonuclear mice is associated with some difficulty in making antibody to a variety of antigens? Surely the only way to explain it is that the cells collaborate. And that's what Graham Mitchell and I suggested. B cell, which was later called B cell, see the antigen or part of it. T cells have to see the other part. If they don't bind, another T cell would come in, bind, and as a result of this binding, the T cells are activated, make some kind of pharmacological agent, we called it, and the B cell can now make antibody. Now, what did the immunology community say to all this? As Gus mentioned already, Gans was very keen to say that it's only one type of lymphocyte. Gus mentioned that too. And he said, I think that's quite true. Let me read you what he said. If we have two cell lines that are collaborating, then we have specificity residing in two cell lines. One thymus-derived, the other marrow-derived. The problem is to bring these two cell lines together. Does this necessity for the two cells to find one another cause problems? It seems a rather inefficient mechanism. He's right. Absolutely. But we did not know the anatomy of the lymphoid system. We did not know anything about chemokines. We did not know how cells migrate. And we did not know that there's a third cell type called a dendritic cell, which is absolutely essential for collaboration. And finally, of course, you heard from Gus in Morrison. Now, I'd like to give one example of how, well, I could say 50 years of T-cell work has been translated into the clinics with spectacular results. You have the third cell type, which I mentioned, dendritic cells, which can gobble up fragments, any fragments. Here I've got tumor cell fragments. And presented, I got too fast, presented to the T cell. And as a result of this presentation, the T cell has a co-stimulator factor, CD28 here, which binds to another ligand onto the dendritic cell. And as a result of the two signals, the T cell is activated. But the T cell attacks with such ferocity that it has to have some way of down-regulating it. And it has a checkpoint inhibitor called CTLA4, which binds to CD80 and prevents much of the inflammation that the T cell would produce. This happens soon after activation. Later on in the immune response, another checkpoint inhibitor is put out, it's a PD-1, which turns off the T cell, so it won't cause collateral damage. So that's built in by nature, that's fine. But cancers have utilized this checkpoint inhibitors to their own advantage. A cancer like melanoma puts out a ligand called PD-L1, which binds to PD-1 and makes sure that all the T cells will have activated PD-1, which stops them from being activated. So they turn them off. And people in America, very clever people, have decided, well, if we make antibodies against checkpoint inhibitors, we should prevent this. And they did. The other thing I forgot to mention is that the cancer recruits Treg cell, which also dampens down the activity of the T cell. So the antibodies that made in America against checkpoint inhibitors, one is anti-CTLA4, which binds to the CTLA4 molecule. Another one, of course, is anti-PD-1, which prevents the tumor from causing, from putting out its ligand, and the ligand will not be able to bind to PD-1, and therefore the tumor will not be able to switch off the cancer cell, the T cell, sorry. Okay, well, that's what happens. There's a tumor, can't do anything, so the T cell can now come and attack it. Beautiful. And here are the results. At least there, you see a screen, a melanoma on the back. After 12 weeks of nothing happens, you need longer, it starts to respond, and it's gone. Now, this happens only in 20% of cases of melanoma. The other 80%, melanoma is a tumor which has a very high mutation rate. So you can imagine it can mutate lots of other things. It can mutate a pathway which the T cell uses in order to kill it. Any protein on that pathway can be mutated. So what the T cell do, like putting out gamma interferon, it will no longer be able to switch on the pathway to kill the tumor cell. So there are in many ways in which a cancer can mutate to prevent us to prevent T cells from attacking it. So I think if we find out all these pathways and we know how to overcome them, I am sure that within 20 years, we'll be able to cure many cancers by using T cells. So I think as a conclusion, I would say that basic research on T cells has spawned immunotherapy, which now can claim a seat in the therapeutic pantheon of oncology next to and probably about to supersede surgery, radiotherapy, and chemotherapy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Stay there. Great to see that the passion is still there after 50 years. I think it came through in every slide, especially Burnett's comments. They were ones that elicited the most passion. And I know Don, when he was alive, also thought that Burnett's comments were the things that spurred him on to great things as well. So I think there's a message there for directors of the Institute. We want to present you with a few anniversary presents.
Oh, my God.
So could I ask Charlotte and G to come up as well? Two wonderful young immunologists who I think in many ways are following in your footsteps, Charlotte, along with a lot of other people at the Institute. On behalf of the whole Institute, thank you for your contribution. You are a stalwart of the Institute and somebody that we know will be here for many years to come, inspiring us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacques. You're an inspiration to us.
And I'm willing to pose nude for you.
I have to open this. Maybe
We can open it up.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I'd like to invite everybody to join us out in the auditorium after Jacques has said a few words
I
for tea.
just want to thank Doug for having this ceremony, and I'd like to give the Institute some kind of present.
This is the anniversary exchange.
Thank you. It's a bit heavy.